I lost my dog about 6 months ago. He was getting old and had some serious and untreatable health issues come on suddenly. I live alone and have had a difficult time with the loss. I read somewhere that it's a good idea to continue with your same routine in order to help work through the grief. I used to take my dog for a walk every night, usually after midnight. He loved it, and I preferred to go out late when it's nice and quiet. I stopped going for walks after he passed, so about a week ago I decided to start walking again, just like I had before. I live in a residential section of the city that is set up like a grid. For the most part, it's pretty quiet at night. The further you get from my house, the darker and quieter it gets, and you'll end up along the river. Near the water, there is a lot of abandoned industrial property, and on the other side of the road there are houses. A few nights ago, I went out and was walking on the sidewalk of the road that runs along the river. There's an area where there are vacant lots for a couple blocks on both sides of the road. The last house right before this seems to have a lot of activity. I walked this route almost every night for 3 years since I lived here, and this is the only house where you will see and hear people being kinda loud and carrying on in the middle of the night. It usually sounded like they were partying, loud music, people yelling. When I was almost in front of the house, I could see there were 4 or 5 people standing in the driveway. I've seen people outside many times before, but never talked to anyone, just quietly walked past with my dog. He was a pretty big fella and looked intimidating, so I always felt a bit safer with him. But I'm a guy that's well versed in self-defense, so let's just say I'm well prepared to protect myself. I kept facing forward as I moved past the house, and as I came into view, I could hear their conversation get noticeably quiet as their attention turned to me. One of the men spoke up. "Hey man, where are you headed?" "Just out for a stroll," I replied. The man spoke again. "We need a light, man. You got a lighter?" I replied, "Sorry, wish I could help, but I don't smoke." I kept walking, and about 10 seconds later, I heard the distinct sound of a lighter flicking. I got that sick feeling in my stomach as I looked back to confirm my suspicion. I saw the soft glow of a flame cut behind a pair of hands as one of the men lit a cigarette. Something wasn't right. I just had that feeling now. I continued my pace and made it past the vacant lots. Once I got in front of the next house, I'd be out of view. My plan was to turn at the next block and start heading back toward my house. I passed the house and I could hear car doors slam in the distance. I wasn't far from the corner now, but I saw headlights coming from behind me. When I looked, the car was moving slow, like too slow to be trying to get anywhere. I turned the corner hoping to get out of view, but as soon as I did, there was another car turning towards me at the next corner up ahead. I felt like those guys were trying to trap me, but I tried to be rational and consider that maybe it was just someone on their way home. Only making it a few steps around the corner, I stopped for a moment, then crossed to the other side of the street. As I did, the car had stopped and just sat in the middle of the road. I was pretty sure that it was those guys following me. I moved back towards the road I just turned from and tried to continue as if I hadn't turned down the side street at all. I got past the corner and heard the car speeding up. I tried to stay calm, but I knew I didn't have many options. The car reached the corner and I could hear a guy yell, "Hey man, get back here. Where are you going?" I took off running across the street and ran behind the first building I saw. There are a few buildings that ran along the river, but when you get to the end of the road, there's a trail that runs along the last building near the water, but it connects to a completely different road about a half-mile away. I've walked it many times during the day, but never at night. I made it to the last building where a fence butts up to the water. There is just enough room for a person to get through. As I went through, one of the cars came racing up and screeched to a stop. I ran as fast as I could through the trail while I could hear the men yelling things like, "You're dead, you better pray we don't catch you." I'm not sure if any of them ever chased after me on foot, but I never looked back to find out. I followed the path and made it back to my house, probably 10 minutes later. Once I caught my breath, I looked up the address of that house on my computer. I called the police and reported the incident, giving the best descriptions I could of the men and the vehicles. I waited about a half hour and I got pretty curious. I hopped in my car and drove over by the house. I could see the police lights flashing as I got closer. The two vehicles that followed me were in front of the house, with 4 police vehicles surrounding them. I couldn't tell for sure where any of the men were, but I like to think the cops got them for something. I grew up with an older sister who was 2 years older than me, and my older brother who was 4 years older than me. We grew up in a smaller city, nothing huge but big enough to have all the big chain stores and restaurants and car dealerships and all that. Big enough to have your fair share of crime as well. We lived in a few different houses when I was a kid, and the first house I remember living in wasn't the nicest. It was in a shady part of town. This story happened there, and I was 6 or 7 years old at the time. My parents have always been very social, and they liked to go out on weekends, which meant that we'd have a babysitter once or twice a week. They usually had one of the 2 regular babysitters watch us, but on this particular night, they both must have been busy, so one of our cousins watched us instead. His name is Ricky, and at the time was probably like 17 years old. I remember it was a warm summer day. My parents were planning to be gone just for the evening. They left money for us to order pizza. After we finished eating, my brother and sister and I went outside to play. We lived on the corner, so there was room for us to spread out a little. I don't remember exactly what we were all doing. It was likely some variation of riding bikes, drawing with chalk on the sidewalk, or maybe just kicking a ball around. We weren't allowed to go much further than the edge of the yard, so we were all pretty close. Ricky would come and go back and forth, inside the house and outside to check on us occasionally. The rule was always that we had to go inside when it got dark. The sun had gone down, but we still had a little time left. That's when Ricky came running out of the house. He stopped abruptly in the middle of the driveway with a scared look on his face. We all took notice as his eyes panned at each of us. "That's what I thought. You're all out here. I heard something upstairs," he said. I remember starting to feel scared, simply because I'd never seen Ricky act scared like that before. We watched as he stopped to think for a few moments. He guided us away from the house a little bit, and then he turned back and looked around. "Oh my God, did you see that? There's someone in the window." Now we were all terrified. Ricky yelled again, "There, did you see it? There's someone in the upstairs window. I just saw him." It was my parents' bedroom. I didn't even want to look, I was so scared. I remember starting to cry as I started to imagine the worst things my little mind could come up with. I had no idea what to do. None of us did. We all looked to Ricky for guidance and safety. This was back before cell phones. We only had a landline, which was inside the house. Ricky was just as scared as we were, but was scrambling to come up with a plan since he was in charge. He let us into our detached garage and locked the door. My siblings and I huddled in the corner together, all very upset. I couldn't comprehend the fact that there was an unwelcome intruder inside the house. There were some small windows on the garage door that Ricky was able to watch through. He kept looking, and I know there were a couple other times where he said he could see them in different windows. I remember him being really scared as well, which wasn't helping any of us to stay calm. We waited in the garage until my parents came home, which seemed like the longest wait of my life. When they arrived, Ricky went running out to tell them what happened before they went into the house. This part of the experience is kind of a blur, but I think my mom stayed with us in the garage while my dad went inside to make sure it was safe. I remember that the police showed up before we were all able to go back inside. They never found anyone, but it didn't really matter. Not to me anyways. I can't speak for my siblings, but my sense of safety in that house was shattered. I never felt comfortable being there after that, and it stayed that way until we moved to a different house a couple years later. Even then, I never felt safe being home alone once I was older and able to be by myself. It was one of the scariest things that had ever happened to me. I'm 36 now. I'd forgotten about it for a long time. About 2 or 3 years ago, I was with my parents and the story popped into my head and I brought it up. Do you remember when someone broke into the house while Ricky was babysitting us? My mom immediately had a weird look on her face. She said, "Yeah, we never told you guys, but that's not what happened." My parents went on to explain that no one was ever in the house. Ricky fabricated the entire thing. My parents had $400 or $500 cash hidden in one of their drawers in their bedroom. It was money they were saving to take us on a vacation to Disney World. Apparently Ricky stole it. Then he made up the story that someone broke in to cover up the fact that he took the money. I'm not really sure how they figured that out. Maybe nothing in the house was disturbed other than the money being gone. I was pretty shocked and a little upset actually. I asked, "Why didn't you tell us that?" I was traumatized thinking that someone had come into our house. I never felt safe after that. My parents apologized, and my dad said something like, "Well, as parents, you try to do everything you can to protect your family, but you won't get everything right. You'll make mistakes along the way. We thought long and hard about telling you guys, but we couldn't decide which is worse. Letting you think that someone broke in, or explaining that a close family member would fabricate such a story to cover up the fact they stole from us. It was a lose-lose situation." For the past 12 years, I've worked at a local theater. Just for some background and context, this isn't a movie theater, it's a performing arts theater, so we're talking plays and musicals, stuff like that. It's nonprofit and volunteer-based and has been around for a little over 100 years. I have a regular full-time job, so I help out at the theater in my spare time. I don't get involved with the actual performing. You could say I'm more of a building maintenance guy. I do a lot of background tasks like structural stuff and getting stages set up and that sort of thing. Sometimes the theater isn't being used for several weeks, so I stop in every couple days and just make sure there aren't any plumbing or heating and cooling issues. I'm often in the building by myself and usually at night or very early in the morning before I go to work at my regular job. Like I said, the theater has been in operation for over 100 years, so the building is very old, although it's had a lot of renovations done over the years. There has been paranormal activity in the building ever since I started working there. You hear random noises a lot, lights get turned on and off randomly, small items get knocked over once in a while, things get moved around. I was a little freaked out by this at first, but having dealt with it for so many years now, it doesn't really bother me at all. It's just normal there. In fact, it may sound weird, but I almost get a little annoyed with it sometimes, and I'll jokingly yell back at whatever it is to quit screwing around or quiet down. It feels like someone or something is trying to distract me when I'm trying to get things done, so it's just my way of dealing with it. About a year ago, there was a long stretch where the theater wasn't being used for a few weeks. During the same time, I went out of town on vacation for a week. When I returned, I went to the theater to check things out, but also needed to move some things around in the basement and start getting prepared for an upcoming event that was on the schedule. My sleep was all goofed up from my vacation, so I ended up going to the theater after midnight on a Saturday night, technically Sunday morning. I made my typical rounds through the main parts of the building and then moved on to rearranging some things. I worked for maybe an hour or two and decided to take a little break and then work for a couple more hours. I took off and drove to a nearby fast food restaurant to grab a snack and some coffee. It was around bar closing time, so there was a long line. I was gone for about a half hour by the time I returned to the theater. When I got back, I noticed that there was an SUV that was parked along the back of the building that wasn't there when I left. I always park off to the side, so I probably would have seen it. We have a pretty big parking lot, and there is also a public parking lot next to it. There are a couple bars nearby, and it's pretty common to see a car or two in the lot on the weekends. This one was in more of a darker area, but I didn't think much of it since it wasn't in the way of anything. I went inside, ate my sandwich, and then got back to work. I finished upstairs and then had to move a bunch of stuff to and from the basement. I went downstairs and the lights were already on one side. This was odd, but also not that odd considering the weird stuff that happens there. I turned on the rest of the lights and realized that there was a lot of stuff out of place. There were a couple racks left out and some things knocked over. It's normally very organized and tidy down there. I moved them back into place and began locating the stuff I needed to move upstairs. I started hearing sounds coming from the other side of the room, kind of a clunking or banging sound. Again, not necessarily unusual for this place. I took a load upstairs and came back down. I grabbed a few more things and began making my way up the stairs when I thought I heard a muffled voice under a couple of clunks. To ease my mind, I yelled something like, "When I get back, you better be quiet," just like I always did. I set the items down and headed back towards the stairs. I could hear what sounded like people running and then a door slam in the basement as I started to walk back down. This wasn't one of the unexplainable sounds that you would normally hear in the building. I reached the bottom and looked around. I was a little scared at this point, honestly, and yelled, "Time to go, I've got work to do." As soon as I said this, a repetitive clunking sound started and some kind of muffled moaning. It was as if it was responding to me, which is not normally what happens either. I was really concerned now. The basement is pretty large and I slowly moved towards the sound. There's sort of a main area, but towards the back there are multiple smaller rooms that are usually left locked, one of which is the boiler room. As I got closer, it was clear that the sound was coming from inside that room. I checked the handle to make sure it was locked, but it wasn't. I opened the door and jumped back when I saw what was on the other side. There was a man handcuffed to a pipe, struggling. He looked beat up and exhausted. His face was bruised. His wrists were red and scraped up like he was trying to fight his way out of the position he was in. I was frozen. He started to speak, but it was hard to hear him. It was like he lost his voice. It was very raspy and quiet, but he kept repeating, "Get me out of here. Get me out of here, please." You could see the fatigue in his body as he stood there hunched over, barely able to hold himself up. I called the police and they arrived a few minutes later. The scene from here on out was quite the whirlwind. There were a lot of officers that showed up. They cut him free and an ambulance took him to the hospital. I gave my statement to the police that night, but they contacted me the following day and asked me to come into the station. They said they wanted to get some more information. I agreed and met with two detectives. They asked me if I knew someone by the name of so-and-so. I won't say his name here, but I knew him. He was another long-time volunteer at the theater. His wife was involved in a lot of the plays, and he helped behind the scenes for almost as long as I had been there. I was pretty confused. He and his wife were always very nice, respectable people. They continued to ask questions about him, and it became obvious that he was somehow involved with the guy that I found the night before. I finally just asked what was going on. One of the officers began explaining. Well, we can't go into a lot of detail, but it seems as if he was responsible for the man you found last night, and he's been arrested. He was apparently at the theater when you came back, and he ran when he heard you. We're trying to gather any information we can. I couldn't wrap my head around this. I asked, wait, what? This doesn't make sense. Why would he have a guy handcuffed down there? The officer then replied, all we can tell you is that the man you found had been chained up for 2 days, and he was his daughter's ex-boyfriend. He allegedly did something unspeakable to his daughter, and let's just say that he was taking justice into his own hands. I never got much more detail than that, but I've been very curious at what it was that would lead to such a decent man doing something like that. I'm also assuming that he didn't expect me to be there that night. What was he going to do if I hadn't been? I hate to say it, but I also can't help but wonder if it was a good or bad thing that I came back when I did.